I'm going to be talking through what you need to do for your first piece of literature coursework, which is on Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. So the title you were given was Shylock, Villain or Victim? Explore how Shakespeare shapes your view of this character. It's important, first of all, to make sure that you remember the assessment objectives for this essay. As well as AO1, you're assessed on AO2, that is basically form, structure and language, and also AO4, which is context. Now, you've had emailed around to you a sheet in which the key contextual points for Merchant of Venice are laid out for you, and it's up to you to link them to your arguments. Now, in terms of how you structure this essay, there are two ways that you can approach this. Number one, the way I prefer is doing it pretty much chronologically. So for a basic response, you would have one section on Act 1, Scene 3, one section on Act 3, Scene 1, and one section on the trial. And in all three of these paragraphs, you would consider both sides of the question, whether Shylock is a villain or a victim. So, like this, if that's clear. And that way you can analyse and consider how there are different interpretations to a particular scene. Now, most of you, well, many of you for whom this podcast or webcast or video or whatever you call it these days is intended, have actually done it as in a two-part structure. So you've talked about Shylock as a villain and Shylock as a victim and treated those two separately. And that's fine, okay? And that's how I'm going to approach it in this broadcast or whatever. So just bear in mind that if you do, or if you have chosen this way to structure it, I'm going to be using the following structure: victim, villain, and then I'm going to be treating the trial as its own separate section, because in this scene, the villain and victim combines, and Shylock, as you know, changes roles dramatically. So, section 1, Shylock as victim. Okay, we are going to look at Act 1, Scene 3 and Act 3, Scene 1 as the key scenes. We'll start with Act 1, Scene 3. So, Shylock as a victim in Act 1, Scene 3. In Shylock's monologue, this is the first time that he gets to express himself freely and fully in front of Antonio, who has been his tormentor for a long time. Shakespeare emphasises this through his use of repetition, having Shylock repeat the anti-Semitic insults that he has suffered for much of his life. So let's find them. Still have a bonnet with a patient shrug, etc. You call me misbeliever, cutthroat dog, and spit upon my Jewish gabardine. Where else do we see references to dogs and spitting? Whoops. Here we are. Dog and cur, and at the bottom here, dog, and so on. So essentially the language point here is repetition of typical contemporary anti-Semitic insults. And so that enables Shakespeare to present Shylock as the victim and to increase our sympathy for him. Okay, so that is our first point for victim based on this speech, and your evidence is as I've highlighted. After Shylock's powerful speech, however, Antonio reacts in a way that suggests he's totally unsympathetic. He says, "I am as like to call thee so again, to spit on thee again, to spurn thee too." We can use this to develop our last point. We see Shylock as a victim, and our sympathy with him is increased because of how Antonio is completely unmoved by Shylock's speech. This is emphasised through his mocking repetition of the words we've just discussed. Remember, Shylock, to get our sympathy, repeated words such as spit and spurn. What does Antonio do? He repeats them back to him. So he says, "to spit on thee again, to spurn thee too," deliberately quoting Shylock back at him. So now we've analysed Shylock's speech. We've now moved on to analysing what his tormentors do. And so we can say Shakespeare further presents Shylock as a victim by presenting Antonio's total lack of sympathy, demonstrated by his mocking repetition of Shylock's words. One important way in which Shakespeare establishes Shylock as a victim is how he allows us to see the abusive actions of his tormentors. In this extract, Shylock has just used a Bible story to justify his practice of lending out money and charging interest. Remember that back then this was illegal for Christians and only the Jewish people were allowed to do so. Antonio's response to this Bible story is to say, "Mark you this, Bassanio, the devil can cite scripture for his purpose." The devil can cite scripture for his purpose. So this is a really important quote because clearly we've got the religious language used here. And in fact, this whole quotation, "the devil can cite scripture for his purpose," is a biblical allusion. This is to when Christ was tempted in the desert by the devil, who quoted the Bible at him, and Christ was able to overcome him and outmaneuver him, as it were. But either way, the point is that after Shylock has shared some of his faith with Antonio, Antonio uses this contemptuous religious language calling him a devil, which is highly offensive, especially given what Shylock has just said. A second and very important point for this is a particularly poignant image that Shakespeare uses. Shylock says, "For sufferance is the badge of all our tribe." Now, this can mean two things. First of all, badge can be a metaphor. If suffering is their badge, it means that it's something for something that's associated with them. It's like they wear suffering all the time. The fact that they suffer is something that identifies them. However, badge also brings to mind a visual image that you can see on screen. Especially from our own post-Holocaust perspective, when we are confronted with the image of Jews wearing badges, that immediately brings to mind what you can see on screen, the badges that Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe were forced to wear in order to identify them. In many communities in Renaissance Europe, such as Venice, in which the play is set, the members of the Jewish community did have to wear badges. And so, this is not only a metaphor saying that suffering is what identifies them as Jewish, but also links to the yellow badge that they were forced to wear. So that's our second idea, quotation, and discussion for this victim section in Act 1, Scene 3. We can then move on to Act 3, Scene 1, in which Shylock enters a scene clearly devastated by what his daughter has recently done. As you'll recall, in Act 2, she elopes, she runs away to marry a Christian. Shylock's distress is portrayed through the sentence structure here. You know, none so well as you, of my daughter's flight. Notice the fragmented syntax here. These sentences are broken up, which emphasises his emotional distress. The climax of this scene, however, and arguably the climax of the entire play in many ways, is Shylock's speech on revenge in Act 3, Scene 1. Once again, we're looking at this mostly from the sympathy perspective here, and have a look at what's on the screen, and that is essentially the language and the persuasive devices that he uses. So I'd recommend choosing 2 or 3 of these in order to develop your argument on how Shakespeare increases our sympathy for Shylock here. And there are probably 2 things that you can say about this passage as a whole. Number 1, it increases our sympathy for Shylock, as we saw, for example, in the use of emotive language, in which he discusses the abuse he's received from Antonio and the Christians. The second part, however, is how he justifies his desire for revenge. Although, as we'll find out in the next section, revenge was forbidden, Shylock's argument here is very logical. It's very well put together, very persuasive through the effect of the rhetorical questions and so on. And so even if the audience may not agree with the morality of revenge, they could at least see the logic. We can now move on to the second half of our essay, Shylock presented as a villain. An important thing to remember, and something that you must communicate, is that, especially to a modern audience, Shakespeare may well be repeating common, popular anti-Semitic stereotypes from his time. Back then, they would not be recognised as racial stereotypes, but today, our interpretation would be different. Make sure you mention that clearly. One early piece of evidence for Shylock being a villain is in Act 1, Scene 3, his aside. Now, contextually, of course, an aside was something that only the audience and the character speaking it could hear. The other characters on stage aren't meant to hear it. So notice Shylock's language here, and the key phrase really is the last line, "I will feed fat the ancient grudge I bear him." Now, as we've discussed, feed fat implies he won't get revenge on Antonio just to satisfy himself. It's something that will give him pleasure. Feed fat, a sense of indulgence. And this brings us on to the theme of revenge. Here's a key context point that you should mention. Revenge was forbidden to Christians in the Bible. The quote is, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." So Shylock's desire for revenge is something that Christians will have been taught is morally wrong. Shylock's revenge is returned to in Act 3, Scene 1, when he is asked what Antonio's pound of flesh will be useful for. He answers, "To bait fish withal. If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge." This quote is very problematic, as you can see on screen. To Shakespeare's audience, it would be clear evidence that he is a villain. Notice the cannibalistic imagery here of feeding. However, a modern audience would notice that this is actually an anti-Semitic stereotype. It builds upon the idea of the blood libel, an anti-Semitic allegation that Jews murdered non-Jews in order to obtain blood for their rituals. This is something that had its origin in the Middle Ages, and the Nazis, for example, were very enthusiastic about it. So Shakespeare's audience would probably have taken this without question. A modern audience would recognise this for the racist stereotype it is. We can now move on to the trial scene, in which the victim and villain sides combine. The key point with the trial is, as you might recall from the classwork, the graph we did, Shylock goes from a powerful character to one who is totally powerless, and, in a sense, goes from villain to victim. At the start of the trial, he's presented as someone who's confident of winning and confident in getting his pound of flesh. By the end of the trial, he's reduced to begging for his life. The simplest way that Shakespeare does this is through presenting Shylock's absolute obsession with revenge and getting his bond. So we have repetition here, I'll have my bond. Shylock also makes extensive use of legalistic language to give the sense that he is in control and the law is on his side. Another key way in which Shakespeare not only makes Shylock seem powerful at this point, but also like a villain, making us not sympathise with him, is how Shylock is not affected when Shakespeare makes us sympathise with the other characters. So you can mention one of these, either Antonio being presented as a victim or Portia's own arguments. Antonio is presented in the trial as a condemned man, and he does not attempt to stand up for himself or to argue back to Shylock. So his sense of despair arguably makes us sympathise with him and perhaps makes Shylock want to be merciful. So, one of the key images he uses is, "You may as well go stand upon the beach and bid the main flood bate his usual height." He is saying that to reason with Shylock is as pointless as trying to persuade the sea not to come in. So that's a metaphor there, and also an allusion to King Canute. He also uses emotive language when bidding farewell to Bassanio, with phrases such as "say how I loved you." This makes him seem like a pathetic figure who can not really do any harm, and so once again we would urge Shylock to take pity on him, but of course he doesn't. Alternatively, you could write about Portia instead. Remember, Portia is disguised as a lawyer, and she attempts to persuade Shylock by giving a speech all about why mercy is such a good thing. One of the most important parts of her speech is the religious language. "We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy." This is, of course, a direct reference to the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer, of course, says, "And forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them that trespass against us." To Shakespeare's audience, this allusion to religious teaching would be immediately clear. Shylock, however, is totally unmoved. His immediate response is the exclamation, "My deeds upon my head, I crave the law." The climax of the trial scene, however, is the peripeteia, the turning point in which Shylock's role changes from someone powerful and in control to someone who is totally powerless. As you'll remember, Portia finds a loophole in the bond. He is permitted to take his pound of flesh, but he is not allowed to shed a drop of blood. And she finds various other legal loopholes that prevent him from doing so. So Shylock goes from the height of his confidence to a much lower position. We can see the climax of his confidence in the exclamation, "O noble judge, O excellent young man." You could say this makes him seem even more villainous because of the pleasure he is getting and the sense of excitement. However, after the turning point, in which Portia tells him that he is unable to get his bond, his language changes dramatically. Portia forces him to kneel down. She says, "Down, therefore, and beg mercy of the Duke." Now, contextually, Shakespeare did not use many stage directions, but he clearly wanted Shylock to be kneeling on stage. That's why Portia gives him the direct instruction to kneel down. This would have created a highly significant visual image representing the change in roles here. After Shylock has begged for his life, there is an extra punishment. Not only must he give up half his goods, but he must convert and become a Christian. A modern audience would naturally be more sympathetic here than a Shakespearean audience. Shylock is being forced to completely give up his identity. The effect this has on Shylock is clear from his language at the very end. We remember previously how he was a very articulate character, able to argue in long, elaborate speeches. However, his sentences become much shorter, and he ends with, "I pray you, give me leave to go from hence. I am not well. Send the deed after me, and I will sign it." He leaves quietly. And finally, the conclusion. Well, that's up to you, but ideally you should sum up your argument and give your own personal opinion as to whether, on balance, Shylock is a villain or victim. Look carefully at all the resources I've emailed around. Make sure you have referred to language, make sure you've analysed the effect of quotations, and make sure you've made at least 5 or 6 detailed specific context points.